Chapter 12 of A Story of Love by Francis Cassilly. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 12. God's Home Within Me. A very natural question in connection with the indwelling of the Holy Spirit is why He is said not to be, but to abide or dwell within the soul. To live or abide in a place means much more than a casual or temporary stay. The traveler, who is in need of shelter or refreshment, puts up in an inn or hotel, or camps by stream or wayside, but only a permanent place of abode is called a home. Unfortunate indeed is the man without a home. Doomed to a nomadic existence, he is a wanderer on earth, a pariah among his fellows. He lacks completeness, for home is but a complement of one's being. Even the dog has its kennel, the sheep its fold, and the wild beast its lair, and divine wisdom tells us that the foxes have their holes and the birds of the air their nests. Man, having a body, must have a habitat for it, a domicile where he may find repose when weary, and store what is necessary for his manifold needs. In it he guards and secures his treasures, and places all that he prizes most. In the home are ease and respite from toil, and all arrangements for comfort and convenience. Here the owner is master. At least one spot on earth is his, where he can come and go at will, where he has full sway, and his orders and commands are obeyed. Here he is sovereign, both lawmaker and executive. None can say him nay. Humble indeed and lowly this home may be, only a cabin on the moor, a hut in the wilderness, but at least it is sacred, safe from prying intrusion. The sacred character of the hearth was appreciated even by the pagans of old, who placed on guard by it the lairs and penates, and in the Middle Age the privacy of the home was protected by wall and drawbridge and moat. God then, coming to dwell in the soul, makes it His home. Men who can choose their abode pick out a location favored by nature's charms, where the wind blows free under sunlit heavens and nigh to forest, field, and stream. Like a diamond in its setting, they place their retreat where weald and wold bloom fairest. Does God act differently? Has He less care of His home than man? Would He dwell in an unkept hovel, open to wind and weather, where dust and grime contest His sway? No, the home of the Deity in which He would take pleasure should be swept and garnished, pure and undefiled. Hence He cannot dwell in the sinful soul, which must be purged before His entrance of grievous sin. But the most stately of manors, enclosed by park and hedge, is not always a home, nor even the cheeriest of bungalows half hid by climbing roses and girt by velvet lawn and gay borders of flowers. These may be but a prison house to the fettered spirits of the unwilling tenants. A home must shelter contented inmates, and inmate and dwelling must grow until each becomes a part of the other, as the turtle and its shell. A new house, starting with fresh paint and odorous of varnished furniture fresh from the factory, will need many a day of adjustment before it becomes a home. Memories must cling about it more redolent than its scented vines, and recollections of many a summer heat and wintry blast, as well as of interior storms and gentle peace, that alternately held sway within the hearts of the occupants. Within our soul, God dwells gladly. He is not imprisoned there against His will, and so it is His home, where He loves to be. There He is unconstrained and free, perfectly at ease. He is master and owner in the house He has built without hands. No one there disputes his right to be and possess, to dispose and arrange at pleasure. There he plants and sows the seeds of virtue, and makes a garden enclosed, a paradise of pomegranates, of spikenard and saffron, sweet cane and cinnamon, and in its midst a well of living waters. And when the winds of heaven blow through his garden of delight, they are laden with heavenly odors. God's fingers paint the lily, and deck the olive in green, but that might almost be styled apprentice work in comparison with the exquisite, ravishing beauty of virtue's bloom and fruit within the garden of the soul. And what makes God a contented lodger within our soul? His ability to control and manage everything in it, the lights and shades and sounds, the domestic economy, order and arrangement. Everything there should be to His taste and liking. Our thoughts, desires, wishes, aims and ambitions, the conversation and entertainment we provide Him. Above all, there must be a constant intercommunication of the offices of affection between Him and us. When love flies out of doors, the home ceases to exist. To love and to be loved, this is the essence of home. God will stay so long as our heart beats in unison with His, but when we grow aweary of Him and become enamored of sinful objects, He will depart, leaving us to entertain the foe and the stranger. Like other householders, God stores His treasures and prized possessions in His home under bolt and key. And what are these treasures He guards so jealously? They are grace and the habitual virtues that belong to it. All the day long God is busy in our soul, bringing in new ornaments of affection, beautifying, decorating His habitation to make it alike worthy of Him and us. This is His constant occupation and toil, which never weary or fatigue Him. We sleep, but He ever watches, lest while He slept the marauder might come and despoil His abode. He would allow no unbidden guest to cross the threshold where He is sovereign keeper and warden. In His home, the man of affairs throws off the solicitude and restraint of business cares. He draws the curtains on the outside world and forgets its existence, abandoning himself to the delights of the family circle. They become for the moment more important to him than the welfare of a nation. Home is all to him, the real occupation of life, and other things are but seeming. And to God, the interests of His home are all in all, of vastly more moment than the rise and fall of nations, the collision of planets, the death of old suns and the birth of new ones. No concern of ours is beneath Him. We need not fear to annoy or worry Him by our importunities, for whatever pertains to us and our welfare is worthy of His notice and sympathy, simply because it relates to us. His sole desire and employment, so to speak, are to think out new ways of making us happy and adding to the joys of our existence. But an earthly habitation has many enemies, amongst them poverty, sickness, and death. No matter how ideal its conditions, how virtuous its occupants and devoted to one another or refined in their intercourse, a shadow is always impending over it. The most perfect of homes cannot endure. It is but temporal, and so meant to be. At times want and distress descend upon it. When the father sees the roof tree decaying overhead, the rains eating at the foundation, and his loved one shivering with the cold and wasting away from insufficient nourishment, and all for lack of means, his lot becomes truly embittered. Love may still remain, but it becomes only a new source of sorrow when it cannot bring relief to the suffering. And what home escapes sickness? It is a legacy of original sin, and is always seeking to enter through the chinks of doorway or casement. And in the event, it always succeeds in ensconcing itself by bedside or hearth. Yet evil as it is, it serves to draw closer the heartstrings of the family. The memory of past tribulation is often a sweeter possession than that of a placid and even prosperity. The helplessness of the sufferer not only wins the compassion and sympathy of the strong, but it draws forth the spirit of self-sacrifice. When the invalid sees with the eyes of others, is served by their hands and nursed by their affection, the bonds of family intercourse become riveted as by steel. And thus one great purpose intended by the Creator in the institution of the family is attained: forgetfulness of self. And finally death, the enemy of mankind, ruthlessly enters the happiest of homes and carries away its victims one by one. The sound of cheerful voices is succeeded by silence or the mocking echoes of noises from without, and nothing remains to tell of once happy lives save desolate rooms and blackened embers on the hearth. But in the human habitation chosen by God, there need be no fear of these enemies of domestic felicity. Neither poverty, illness, nor death can approach the soul as long as God dwells within. While He is master, the soul will be rich with His treasures, hale and vigorous with His boundless life. Though, sooth to tell, the soul, even when encircled by God's arms, has enemies of its own, similar to those of the body. It is never entirely secure from temptation, nor free from the gnawing tooth of sorrow and trial. Our threefold enemy is ever watching to assault us with the death-dealing arrows of temptation, but these cannot reach us so long as we nestle in the arms of God. Sorrow, though, and crosses, tribulations, and afflictions will ever be with us, but if we welcome them with outstretched arms as friends of ours and God's, they will not harm, but only purify and strengthen us. God then has made choice of our soul for His home, there to stay, if we but permit Him. In calm and storm, amidst all the vicissitudes of our mundane existence, until our tenement of clay falls apart, when clinging all the closer to our emancipated spirit, He will enlarge it with the fullness of His being forever. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13 of A Story of Love by Francis Cassilly. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13. God's Living Temple. As a king's home is called a palace, so God's dwelling place is called a temple. And since the just soul, as we have seen, is God's abode, it can very properly be styled His temple. And this is the very appellation given it by St. Paul, who tells the Corinthians, "You are the temple of the living God." As God saith, "I will dwell in them, and walk among them, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people." In another epistle he speaks thus, "Know you not that you are the temple of God, and that the Spirit of God dwelleth in you?" In the days of good King David, God complained to him that he had no permanent dwelling place, but that from the day He brought the children of Israel out of the land of Egypt, he had been forced to dwell in a tabernacle or a tent. David then began to prepare for the building of the temple, which was undertaken and finished by King Solomon. Solomon built it on a most magnificent scale, as can be seen from the fact that he had 70,000 men to carry burdens, 80,000 to hew stones in the mountains, and 3,600 to oversee them. And he gathered workers in gold and silver, in brass and iron, marble and wood, and in purple and scarlet and blue. And in that time silver and gold became as common as the stones of the street. And after the destruction of the first temple, the Lord complained by the mouth of the prophet Aggeus that the people dwelt in sealed houses, while his own house lay desolate. This reproach moved the chosen people to begin the construction of the second temple, which, however, seemed so inferior in comparison with the grandeur of the first, that old men, who had seen both, wept on beholding its foundations. To encourage the builders, the prophet foretold, "Great shall be the glory of this house, more than of the first. For into it would come the desired of all nations," meaning by this Jesus Christ. The temple was a holy place, for it was dedicated to the service of God. It belonged to Him, and was sanctified by His presence. On the dedication day of Solomon's temple, the priest could not enter it, because the majesty of the Lord had filled it. "I have sanctified this house which thou hast built, to put my name there forever, and my eyes and heart shall be there always," was God's own promise to Solomon. And Solomon made bold to ask that all prayers might be heard in God's house: the petition for rain when the heavens were shut up, or against the pestilence, mildew, locusts, caterpillars, and when the enemy wasted the country or besieged the cities, and the prayer of the penitent sinner who begged for pardon. And God was pleased to grant the request of Solomon, promising that when his people made supplication to Him and did penance, He would forgive their sins and heal their soul and restrain the ravages of the foe. We recall how Christ, indignant with the money changers and traffickers in the temple, drove them out with knotted cords and upset their tables, because they had changed the temple from a house of prayer to a den of thieves. The Jewish people, favored as they were by God, had only the one temple, while there are millions of Christian temples clustered in cities and scattered over the countryside throughout the world. We call these Christian temples churches, and though some of them are splendid cathedrals or basilicas, triumphs of art and poems in stone, many are but little better than wayside barns or hovels. But one and all, they are grander and more majestic than Solomon's temple. For if the second temple was greater than the first, because it was to be graced with Christ's transient presence, what shall we say of Christian churches, which derive their dignity and honor not from being the storehouse of the ark, or the tables of the law, or the showbread, but because of the Eucharistic sacrifice and the abiding presence of Christ, body and blood, soul and divinity? Hallowed, then, are the temples of the old and the new law to God and His service, to prayer and sacrifice. And not less holy is the Christian soul in which God dwells, or rather more sacred is the soul, for while temples have only extrinsic holiness, insofar as they are reserved for the service of God, the soul is intrinsically, formally holy, possessing moral goodness, participating in the divine nature, beautified and sanctified by living grace, of which no material building is capable. St. Paul argues that as our members are the temple of the Holy Ghost, it must follow that we belong no longer to ourselves, but to Him. He who buys anything becomes its owner. Now we have been bought, purchased at a great price, the blood of Christ, and so we are His property. God has sanctified us and made us His dwelling, and woe to him who violates this sanctuary and retreat, who desecrates his own soul, for such a one is guilty of rapine. He robs the deity of his home, and him shall God destroy. A temple is essentially but an enclosed altar, whether the enclosure be a throng of adorers, a grove of trees on a high place, or walls of stone. And an altar is a stone of sacrifice. The true religion and most of its spurious imitations have ever embodied sacrifice in their worship. In the Old Law, sacrifice embraced a wide range of victims, from the first fruits of field and flock to libations of wine and the burning of incense. At the dedication of Solomon's temple, there were offered 22,000 oxen and 120,000 rams. The Christian religion, too, has its great sacrifice, of which all others were but types and figures, the clean oblation that is offered from the rising of the sun to its setting. And the practical idea of a Christian church is a structure conveniently arranged for the assistance of the faithful at the holy sacrifice. On entering the portals of the church, the eye is at once seized and led by line and pillar, aisle and nave, to the high altar on which rests the sacrificial stone. Arch and wall, sculpture, fresco, cornice and frieze are all subordinated to the absorbing spot, guarded by chancel rail, where the interest centers, so that the imagination almost hesitates whether chancel and transept, wall and roof were built round the tabernacle, or grew out of it by a living growth of stone and marble and tile, as corolla, petal and stamen unfold from the bud. The living temple of God in the soul also has its altar of sacrifice. The sacrificial knife must be ever ready to slay upon it whatever we most prize and cherish. Our own will must be offered as a sweet-smelling holocaust. How dear to the natural man is it to follow his own vagaries, to idle or labor, do or undo, choose or leave, as whim or fancy moves, without sense of responsibility or care. But the supernatural man must restrain will and fancy, make them an oblation upon the altar of self-conquest. To subdue, regulate and conquer natural inclination, and make our own will entirely subservient to God's, is pretty much the whole of the spiritual life. Affection to creatures, those mobile, ever-changing objects outside of us, that are constantly assuming new forms and shapes of loveliness, as the fabled Lorelei, is another appropriate victim of sacrifice. We must learn to regard creatures only as passing manifestations of creative power, to look through and behind them to the Creator Himself. Beautiful indeed and ravishing of spirit are created things, when regarded with a pure and simple eye, as reflections of their Maker and messengers of His eternal love, but death-provoking and sinful when they wean us from God to the worship of themselves. Then they become but false gods, and we their idolatrous worshippers. Creature love is thus to be sacrificed upon the altar of the heart. Not that we are called on to eradicate or destroy our natural affections, but rather to elevate and supernaturalize them by the principles of faith and charity. Natural love, which leads us away from God to rest in creatures for their own sake, is an enemy to the soul. We must learn so to love our neighbor and the good things of life that in and through them we love their Creator, and use or cherish them but for Him. And so it will come to pass that the more we love God, the more tender, intense, and absorbing will be our affection for all His creatures. Thus Moses loved the chosen people when he asked to be blotted out of the book of life if God would not pardon them. So St. Paul loved the Christians when for their sake he wished to be an anathema from Christ. This was the spirit of the great Christian saints, of the gentle Franciscan founder who spoke of brother sun and sister death, and of the innumerable hosts who doomed themselves to lifelong toil and labor, and even to chains and death for the welfare of their neighbor. A temple is a place of silence and prayer. We escape from the turbulent tide that ebbs and flows in the crowded city streets into the quiet recesses of the Christian church, where the noises of life are hushed or subdued into a distant murmur. There the glow of the sanctuary lamp speaks to us of the unseen presence, and we whisper our sentiments of love and devotion. The temple of our soul, too, must be barred to the profane, unholy things without. It must ever be redolent of the lingering incense of prayer, and its aisles must echo only to the voice of praise and adoration. Its silence must not be disturbed by the jangling noises and discord of daily life. Converse with the Deity by ejaculatory prayer. Fervent acts of the will by union of affection and desire must be its normal state. What consolation, when harassed by the worries and trials of life, to know that we are not forced to seek rest and refreshment of spirit in a temple made with hands, that we can instantly have recourse to the hallowed sanctuary of our own soul, where dwells the ineffable presence of the triune God, to whom we can speak in all the fullness of love, and from whom will come an answer, soft, melodious, and clear as the distant peal of an Angelus bell on a still and tranquil evening. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14 of A Story of Love by Francis Cassilly. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 14, Christ's Body to Me. The manifestations of God's love to man, which we have thus far considered, belong in general to the saints of the Old and the New Law. The gifts of nature, which are so touchingly referred to in the Psalms, are the property of all mankind, and the grace of Christ has sanctified the souls of all just men who ever lived. Every descendant of Adam, who loved and served God, was endowed with grace and shared in its privileges. Hence, in the Old Law, the just were friends and children of God, sharers in the divine nature, and temples of the Holy Ghost. But we of the New Law have many privileges and testimonials of love which were denied the saints of the older dispensation. We have the incarnate God dwelling with us on earth, the Church He established, and the sacraments, those brimming channels of grace, besides a multiplicity of other gifts, such as the scriptural writings of the New Testament, the dogmatic and affective writings of the Fathers and an army of other spiritual writers, the inspiriting lives of the saints, miracles, shrines, pilgrimages and devotions, and a wonderful number and variety of religious orders and congregations. All these evidences of God's predilection take their rise from the manifestation of the Godhead in the flesh. To speak in a human way, infinite love wrestled for many a dark and drearisome century with the other divine attributes, until it finally conquered, and God determined to descend to earth. Hitherto, love had been satisfied with lifting men to the divine sphere by grace. Now it would descend to man's level by becoming like him in all things save sin. God would empty and abase Himself, taking the form of a slave. He came upon this tiny, insignificant planet and hid himself in the womb of a virgin mother. The disclosure to mortals came on Christmas night in a vile stable in a retired hamlet of an obscure and enslaved nation. The petty great and powerful of earth were not there to do him homage, but lowly shepherds adored, while angel choirs filled the midnight sky with heavenly radiance and joyful psalmody. And God was made man. He had become a helpless babe. His infatuation for us was at last satisfied. Man had previously been raised to participation in the divine nature. Now God was in the likeness of man. Could love go further? God had espoused human nature, uniting the human and divine in the person of Christ, and by descent from Adam through Mary, He had become brother to each and every human being. Some 2,000 years ago did this incarnation of the Godhead take place, but it has never ceased. It never will cease throughout the ages of eternity. Men repudiated Christ, slew Him, fastened Him to the gibbet in obloquy and disdain, but withal they could not kill His love for them. Though forced to ascend to His Father in heaven, the God-man found a way of still remaining amongst men, of perpetuating His incarnation on earth as well as in the realms of bliss. He instituted the Eucharist, a sacrament in which veils are drawn about His humanity, and in the incarnation the veils of flesh and blood were wrapped round the divinity. In this sacrament of love, Christians are favored above the greatest saints of the old law. Never was it given to them to know Christ as we know Him, to eat His flesh and drink His blood under the appearance of bread and wine. Herein arises a new union of love between God and the Christian. Christ, after His resurrection, dies no more. He lives in the bosom of His Father and daily communicates Himself, body and soul, divinity and humanity, to the faithful. Thus are heaven and earth commingled, God daily descending to earth, and men rising to celestial communion with Him. The body that was fashioned for God the Son in Mary's womb enters the body of each Christian and there abideth, bringing in its train a host of ministering spirits, and giving forth the same current of graces that flowed from it in Christ's ministrations when He trod the hills and vales of Palestine. And why does He come, body and soul, into the bosom of us Christians? That He may abide in us, and we in Him, that so we may have life everlasting. And this mutual indwelling of Christ and us is to be understood not only of His substantial presence within us, but also of the union of charity between Him and us. As material food and drink nourish the body, Christ's body and blood feed and strengthen the soul. Natural food enters into our arteries and veins, and is transmuted from dead elements into living tissue and substance. It is changed into us. Not so with this spiritual food of our soul. Christ's body is not changed into ours, but we, in a manner, are changed into Him. For His body is not dead, but living, and in a union of living things, the higher life prevails. The inferior is absorbed into the superior. The components of earth and air are changed into living grass. This in turn becomes the flesh of grazing herds and flocks, and these animals become man's food and are changed into human substance. Thus, by nature's law, the elements and lower organisms minister to the higher. The inferior life is elevated to the superior. But the divine life is higher than the human, and so Christ's life cannot be changed into ours, but ours is elevated to become His. Thus is verified the expression of Christ Himself, that He lives in us, and we in Him. This is the doctrine taught by the Roman Catechism, which says that the Eucharist is not like bread and wine changed into our substance, but in some measure changes us into its own nature, and this teaching it derives from the Fathers. The primary effect of this sacrament is union with Christ in charity, and this is produced by an increase of sanctifying grace, which is conferred after the manner of spiritual food. This heavenly nourishment makes the recipient live, as it were, with Christ's life, love with His charity, and under the influence of this charity, grow in all other virtues. By this increase of sanctifying grace, the soul is made to tingle with intensest spiritual life, whereby decay is prevented, the number of venial sins is diminished, and the death of grievous sin averted. As the body that is weak and anemic easily falls a prey to the countless germs and bacilli which ever lie in wait for it in air and water and food, seeking entrance into the circulatory system, whereas the strong and vigorous constitution easily repels these invading hordes, so too the soul that is frequently nourished with the body of Christ has strength to ward off the temptations and sins that ever strive to find lodgment in it. With the wealth of sanctifying grace received in communion come a host of actual graces that urge, impel the soul to numerous acts of the theological and moral virtues, and blow the fire of charity to a white heat, consuming in its flames venial faults and the remnants of past sins. The normal effect of material food is to please and satisfy the taste, as well as to nourish the body. And the Eucharistic food likewise brings with it every spiritual savour and sweetness. To it spiritual writers apply the words of the canticle, "Eat, O friends, and drink, and be inebriated, my dearly beloved." The pleasures of the table are proverbial, and to them the carnal and earthly minded devoted a great portion of their existence. Instead of taking sustenance to prepare them for work, they rather take exercise in order to have a relish for more meat and drink. But all the pleasures and delights of the table cannot be compared with the sweetness and joy hidden away in this spiritual banquet of the soul. The moments of transport, when the consecrated host passes the lips of the recipient, cannot be realized or appreciated save by one who has experienced them. The saints were often ravished out of themselves in the reception of the Eucharist. They were lifted from the earth, their countenance shone with the overflow of the radiance from within, and they became insensible to their surroundings. Some noted ecstatics, such as Saint Lidwine of Schiedam, Louis Lateau, and Gemma Galgani, lost the desire of earthly food, and subsisted for months on the Eucharist alone. It was to them not only spiritual substance, but bodily as well. As the taste of persons who are accustomed to delicate viands cannot brook a coarse, common diet, so these chosen souls, after being habituated to the bread of angels, could not endure the rarest and most exquisite material dishes. Here, however, we may note the remark of St. Thomas, that this spiritual refreshment, which all who devoutly approach the holy table perceive, is of two kinds. The first gives us an increase of devotion and sensible consolation, but at times God may withhold this sweetness to give us instead a spiritual taste better suited or more necessary to our condition, namely an understanding or appreciation of its exceeding usefulness for our soul. The Eucharist, then, is a hallowing of spirit by spirit, the sanctification of our soul by God, But it is more than this. It is the touch, as it were, of body to body through the sacramental species. When Christ walked the earth, the touch of His hand, yea, of His garment, wrought wonders, restoring health and vigor to withered limb and atrophied organ. Nor has His glorified body today lost its health-giving power. Christ's body and ours, when united in the sacrament, do not form one substance, for each retains its manner of existence. But as the theologian Vasquez teaches, since love tends to the closest possible union between lover and beloved, Christ, in the vehemence of His affection, is driven to satisfy it by joining His body to ours. Entering within us, He takes possession, considering our body as His, and treating its members as members of His flesh and of His bones. Through the primal sin came the inherited rebellion of the flesh against the Spirit. If man's will refused to obey its Creator, neither would man's body be subject to his mind. The body became a wild, independent agent, seeking emancipation from the control of reason and disregarding the command of its master. It would not brook control, so that even the apostle of the Gentiles cried out in anguish against its tyrannous sway and capricious moods. But at the sacramental touch of Christ's body, it loses to an extent its self-will and ferocity, and returns in some degree to the tamed, serviceable condition in which it was created. Original justice has fled from this sin-accursed planet never to return, but in the bodies of the saints who frequently eat Christ's flesh, there is at least some approach to the state of primitive innocence, and for what is wanting, Christ's grace is sufficient. Whether this gradual subjection of the law of our members to the law of the Spirit be produced indirectly by an augmentation of charity, or by a direct moderating action of the sacrament on the bodily humours and temperament, we shall leave it to the theologians to discuss. Suffice it for us that the effect is there, and that thus some remedy is given to man against the cruel tyranny of passion. What gratitude we owe to God for the chaste generation produced by the wine that springeth forth virgins. Because of the purifying effect of the Eucharist, countless virgins, men and women throughout the centuries, have been enabled to sing in heaven the canticle that only they can sing. Virginal chastity is a rare exotic, which the weed-choked gardens of earth can never of themselves bring forth. Its roots cannot flourish in sin-laden soil, nor can it be propagated by seed or cutting or bud. It must be transplanted from heaven by grace. And it is most often found in those whose bodies are sanctified by the frequent touch of Christ's body through the sacred species. And Christ, dwelling within us, gives our body a title to a glorious resurrection and immortality. Every earthly organism is prone to decay. Birth, growth, decay, and death form the never-ending cycle of every living thing we see about us. Nor is man's body an exception to the general law. It tends to be resolved into its constituent elements. But grace has a saving, revivifying power by which the severed members of the dead body, its scattered ashes and atoms, may be regathered and reconstructed into a living frame. The Eucharist is a living font of grace, and to it in a peculiar sense is attributed our incorporation into Christ's mystic body, which can never die. And when the Fathers attribute the glorious resurrection of the body to the Eucharist, they mean that the intimate sacramental union of Christ's body with ours is a further congruous title for its resurrection, since it were not meet that a body sanctified in communion by Christ's risen body should not itself rise again. And so the theologians tell us that he who receives the Eucharist has two titles to rise again in glory, the first from grace, and the second from the hallowing of his body by Christ's. Thrice happy, then, the Christian who so realizes and appreciates the commingling of Christ's body with his, as the Fathers express it, that he is compelled by love to a daily or frequent reception of the Eucharist. The divine life grafted on his soul will change his nature and make him a godlike being, or rather, since Christ, as he himself tells us, is the vine and we the branches, we shall be grafted on him, and the fruit we produce shall spring from and be nurtured by the sap of the divine life by which we shall live. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15 of A Story of Love by Francis Cassilly. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 15, Face to Face. This life is an exile from home, prolonged through the dragging years, and the imprisoned soul sighs for release from bondage, yearns for the free, boundless life of the heavenly courts. And yet, tedious as is our wayfaring here below, it is not wholly wretched. How could it be, when we swim in an ocean of love as the fish in the sea, when God is our friend and lover, Father and Mother, when He inhabits us, and Christ is ready to enter our tabernacle of clay each morning to nourish us with His own flesh and blood? But from this very fact arises a new source of heart weariness, to know that we are so near to God and yet so far away, that He is in and all about us, and yet for our veils of flesh we cannot see and possess Him. The more ardent our love, the more poignant the anguish of our separation from its object. To become one with our beloved or to die is the cry of the heart. I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, if you find my beloved, that you tell him I languish with love. Never to have known our beloved were indeed a misfortune, but to know him and be separated from him is a rending of the heart. Could any fate be more dolorous than to live forever in this world? Would not the thought of going on in the same round of duties, of rising, working, eating, and sleeping, in an unending cycle, become a hideous nightmare? We dread to die, but to lead without end this present dying life of ours would be a prospect calculated to drive us to distraction. St. John of the Cross, mystic and poet, thus laments, "This life that I am living is a lifeless life, and so a death continuing until I come to live with Thee. O God, hear Thou my cry. This life of mine, I will it not. I am dying because I am not dead." But one cheering thought sustains us, that the hour of freedom will strike for us at last, that no matter how dismal and soul-trying our tasks and labor, the Master Workman will one day give the signal for quitting work and going home to rest. And what kind of existence has our friend, Father and Lover reserved for us beyond the pearly gates, in the city whose streets are of transparent gold, where there shall be no night nor darkness, nor weeping nor mourning, but joy and happiness forevermore? What kind of a mansion is Christ preparing for us in the home of His Father? When we come to consider the magnificent reward that God has prepared for those who love Him, imagination fails, for no matter how great our anticipations may be, they will always fall short of the reality. In our present life, seldom do anticipated joys respond fully to expectation. Some unforeseen obstacle prevents our full enjoyment, and even should we attain the object of our heart's desire, we soon tire of it, so that what beforehand we deemed worthy of attainment seems in the event hardly worth the effort it cost. The opposite, however, is true in regard to the joys of the afterlife. Paint we them in colors never so glorious, the pictured prospect will be more than realized, since eye hath not seen, nor ear heard, nor hath it entered into the heart of man to conceive what God has prepared for those who love Him. One of the divine attributes displayed in creation is munificence or liberality. God is prodigal of His gifts. Economy in man is a virtue, but God knows it not. He is a spendthrift in generosity, for His treasures never diminish. He lavishes them on us beyond all our needs. We require a little air to breathe, and God has made an ocean of it 60 or more miles in height, a huge reservoir we can never exhaust. We require perhaps a dozen articles of diet, and the Creator serves us with thousands and thousands of dishes, varying with soil and climate and season. Our table supplies come from the depths of the ocean, from the realm of air. They grow in field and forest. They hang from trees and multiply underground. St. Ignatius had so lively an appreciation of the divine bounty in this respect, that in returning thanks after meals, his face at times glowed with feelings of gratitude. How many colors are needed to dye the objects about us? Surely not more than the 7 seen in the rainbow, or produced by the prism. And yet these are shaded into an innumerable variety of hues and tints, which in turn are arranged in a multitude of brilliant or sober combinations, each differing from the other, and all harmonious and pleasing to the eye. Look this rich summer morning at yonder prospect of hill and dale, orchard, field and meadow, and count if you can the varied tints of green from light yellowish to deep blue or blackish. You will easily number 100 shades, each herb and plant and tree, singly and in mass, having its own peculiar tint, which too constantly changes at each hour of the day, according to the intensity of the light, the position of the clouds, and the angle of view. This thought we could pursue into never-ending applications. Witness the illimitable expanse of ocean and its unfathomable depths, the unexplored reach of space, sown with suns unnumbered, the almost infinite variety and fecundity of plant and animal life. Who will count the light vibrations of a single candle, or the avalanche of seeds that fall from a maple tree, not one of which perhaps is destined to germinate? And if the hand of Providence is so profuse, almost wasteful, in its gifts to us in exile, what will be its munificence in the place of reward? If the seed time be so abounding, what will the harvest be? In this life, God must put a constant check and restraint on His liberality, lest He overwhelm us with His beneficence, and make this orb so entrancing that we may forget the Giver in the splendor of His gifts. This world, all in all, is but a presage of the next, and so the divine munificence displayed in it is at most but an earnest of what we may expect. The untold riches and delights that He has packed away for us into every moment of the endless age to come are far and away beyond all we can surmise or anticipate. If the antechamber in which we are, says one of the Fathers, is so magnificent, what will the royal throne room be? If the floor of heaven so glistens with its patens of light, what must the superstructure be? The great essential joy of heaven will be the vision, wherein we shall see God face to face, shall know even as we are known, and love as we are loved. Even in this world the greatest pleasure comes from the exercise of our faculties of knowing and loving. To know and understand, this has been the pursuit of sage and philosopher from the dawn of history, and in it they have forgotten all other sublunary things. They have neglected food and sleep and health. They have sacrificed all on the altar of knowledge. To love and strive for the object of desire is a natural beatitude, but God is infinite perfection, and the knowledge we shall have of Him is direct, face to face, the most intimate possible to creature. And love in heaven is not merely that of desire, but of fruition, derived from the possession of Him. We love and are loved. We possess and are possessed. We enjoy and are enjoyed. We are united to God, according to the expression of some of the Fathers, as heat to the molten iron. We are lost, dissolved in Him as two pieces of wax fused together. Our faculties, after the trying vicissitudes of life, are now at rest. The rest, however, is not of inaction, but of perfectly poised and balanced activity. It is the slumber of the revolving flywheel, not of the discarded and rusted tool. It is a repose from labor, not from action. The joy and happiness of the soul in heaven will be increased by reunion with the glorified body, of whose nature and characteristics St. Paul gives us some idea. He compares it to the plant that springs from the seed. And as the plant is but a germination and development of the seed, so the risen body is not a different body from the one we have on earth, but the same, glorified and spiritualized. The qualities of the plant depend on the nature of the seed that is sown. So too will the new qualities of the body in heaven depend on the good works done in the flesh. We shall arise then in the same bodies we possess on earth, but they will be so changed and transfigured as to be unrecognizable. Who could recognize the acorn in the oak, the grub in the butterfly? And yet the one is but the development of the other. The Apostle tells us the body is sown in corruption. It shall rise in incorruption. It is sown or planted in the grave when corrupted in death, and all through life the body tends in a way toward corruption. There is a constant disintegration going on in it, a steady sapping of its vitality, which require a perennial renewal of strength and force. It is ever subject to hunger and thirst and sickness, but in heaven it will have the gifts of impassibility and immortality. No more will death like a gaunt spectre threaten it with extinction. No more shall there be hunger, thirst, or suffering from heat and cold. The exhausting struggle of life will be done. The conflict with penury and want, with sickness and labor, will be over, as well as the tense watch and guard against our enemies. They will have disappeared, and with them fear and the sound of alarms. Peace and tranquility will be our portion, and existence will be one long holiday without care or anxiety. We shall be forever happy children of a loving and all-powerful Father. And as Christ's body shone in the resurrection, so will ours, for His rising is a type of ours. In heaven there will be no need of sun or moon, for the Lamb shall be the light thereof, and each glorified body will be a light to itself. At set of sun, the windows in the east reflect back its glory, until countless suns are beaming with borrowed light, and the bodies of the just in heaven will be refulgent with the reflected glory of God and the overflow of splendor and beauty from the soul. We have Christ's own word for it, that the just shall shine as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. Night and darkness then will be things of the past, to be remembered but as the shadows of an earthly existence. Here we possess ideals of human beauty, of its varying types, suitable to youth and manhood and age, but seldom do we meet one who is perfect in form, in vigor, grace, and complexion. And the most perfect of human bodies is so defiled with natural defects, with the exudations, secretions, and effluvia of its animal nature, that it cannot but be repulsive to a fastidious taste. But all this will be changed in heaven. Whatever is repellent, disgusting in the body will disappear, for according to St. Paul, it will no longer be an animal body, but a spiritual body. Not that our body will cease to be material and become entirely spiritual, for man, being essentially a compound of matter and spirit, can never cease to have a bodily nature, can never become a pure spirit as the angels are. But the animal body we now possess shall be so purified and sublimated, so purged and refined of what is gross and vile and offensive, as to resemble a spiritual nature. The mere animal operations of eating, drinking, and sleeping, of growth and decay, of generation, shall disappear. Jesus rebuked the Sadducees who denied the resurrection, chiding them for not knowing the Scriptures or the power of God, since in heaven there shall be no marrying nor giving in marriage, but men shall be like the angels of God. One of the arguments used by the Fathers for the fittingness of the resurrection is that, as the body of man shared in the conflicts and victories of his earthly probation, so also it should participate in the reward. But how is the body to be rewarded? On earth the pleasure of the body comes directly through the senses, nor is it all of a crass nature. Consider the delight of the eye in beholding light, motion, and color, the wide extending plain and ocean, greening hills and silver streams, the star-studded canopy above, the human countenance and form divine. And all this is but an excess and redundance of the pleasure of sight, not necessary or needful for the ordinary purposes of life. And how the ear is charmed by the harmony of the winds, the dual-set tones and inflections of the human voice, by song and canticle and chorus. Nor are these musical qualities of sound vibration required to convey thought by words, for which a monotonous succession of vowels and consonant sounds would have been sufficient, like the uniform marshalled lines of a page of print. Now, since eye and ear are susceptible of such elevating pleasure on earth, will they have less in heaven? Coarse pleasure, arising from the gross material needs of our animal nature, will be replaced by that which is suitable to the spiritualized condition of the glorified body. St. John, wrapped in vision, saw wondrous sights of beauty in heaven, and he heard canticles sung by the saints and angels, of which he preserved for us some of the words and refrains. And we know that even the angels themselves can descend to earthly melody, as was shown in the hymn they sang on the first Christmas night. Power and strength will be characteristics of the risen body. Its senses and members will be quick and vigorous, ready to respond to the impulse and behest of the soul. It will be endowed with celerity of motion, enabling it to transport itself with the speed of thought from place to place, and to penetrate solid objects at will. Christ will reform the body of our lowness, and make it like to His glorified body. There will be a new heaven and a new earth, according to St. John and St. Peter, and so our bodies will be remade, reformed, to suit the new manner of existence. We shall not be bound to the laws of space and gravity, since St. Thomas tells us that a corporeal place or habitation will not be necessary for our happiness, though we shall have it as an accidental adjunct and an additional pleasure of glory. Even the friendship of others, which is so needful to us on earth, will be but an accidental joy in heaven. The vision of God will so entirely satisfy us and fill all our faculties to repletion that we shall feel no need of solace or refreshment from the companionship of angels and saints. At the same time, while we shall be dependent upon no creature for our essential beatitude, there can be no doubt that close intercourse with the blessed will give us greater added enjoyment than any earthly friendship can bestow. Friends who loved each other in charity so intense that their existences were bound up one in the other will not be severed, but will rejoice 100-fold in each other's beatitude and gifts. And we shall have not 2 or 3 friends, but each one of all the hosts of the blessed will be to us a brother or sister, in whose beauty and perfections we shall rejoice as though they were our own. These are some of the ineffable delights that God has prepared for those who love and serve Him. Every morning on earth is as it were a new creation of loveliness, a call to new life, energy, and activity, and heaven will be but one long day of happiness, with a dawn but no setting, each morning of it bringing new pleasures, a renewal of interest, a renewal of intensest action, a further plunging and immersing into the infinite perfections of God, a deeper and more perfect appropriation and appreciation of Him and the wondrous works of His hands. The angel in the Apocalypse swore by Him who created heaven and earth that time shall be no more, and to the angels and saints of heaven, who live in closest brotherhood with one another and with Christ, their elder brother, one day shall appear as thousands and thousands as but one. For all shall be wrapped in ecstasy and love, beholding God as He is, world without end. Amen. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16 of A Story of Love by Francis Cassilly. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 16. Waiting. Our story of love is ended. Sadly unequal as it is to the inspiration of the theme, and marred in its telling by halting utterance. To weave the tale aright would have required a defter hand and more skilful artificer in speech, if indeed it be possible for earthly skill to do justice to an idyll which the choirs of the blessed will take an eternity to hymn. We realize in a groping fashion that each individual person is a special creation, in whose behalf God seems to tax His infinite resources of love and power, and with whom He wishes to enter into a compact of eternal friendship. But friendship is not one-sided. It is a mutual donation and has reciprocal obligations and duties. Nor is love all words or honeyed sweetness. Not everyone who says, "Lord, Lord," can enter into the heavenly kingdom. Deeds are the true test of friendship. Supernatural love is not something emotional. In fact, it is not in the feelings at all. It is an act of the will, seeking God for Himself, for His own sake, and not for any personal emolument of one's own, not for spiritual sweetness, joy, nor consolation. Desire accompanies love necessarily, and pleasure and delight follow possession. So the soul which loves God must desire Him, and once it possesses Him, it will rest in Him as its final felicity and beatitude. The possession we have in this life is by grace, and hence is not complete, and our enjoyment of Him here is in keeping with our possession, being only in part and inchoative compared with what it will be in heavenly bliss. But the spiritual delights sometimes given to Christians even on earth are so sweet and alluring that spiritual writers are forced to put us on our guard against them. They warn us that neither consolation nor spiritual sweetness is love, but only its effect, and that he who strives after them for their own sake is but seeking self, is indulging in sentimentality, and sentimentality is not charity. It is not even a good counterfeit of it. Many servants of God persevered long years in aridity of soul, deprived of sensible consolation. Prayer was distasteful to them. The fountain of devotion within them was sealed. But what these holy persons lacked in sensible devotion was made up to them in purely spiritual favors, and within the depths of their being they possessed a calm, unalterable peace that enabled them to rise superior to the fluctuations of sense. If we wish to know the true test of love on earth, it is easy to find it. We need not be distressed by uncertainty whether we love God, for Christ Himself has given us the criterion. At the Last Supper He said to His apostles, "He that hath my commandments, and keepeth them, he it is that loveth me." The beloved disciple also tells us that whoever keepeth Christ's word, in him in very deed the charity of God is perfected, and by this we know that we are in Him. If we keep God's law, we love Him, and His commandments are not heavy. They who imagine that charity consists in performing great and marvelous deeds, in long prayers, in constant fasting and penance, in working miracles, in eloquent preaching or lonely vigils, may possibly find themselves mistaken. Without the observance of the commandments, these will amount to nothing. Plodding along faithfully day after day at our appointed tasks, howsoever humble they may be, unseen and unnoticed of men, we may attain to a high degree of sanctity. St. Joseph spent his life at the carpenter's bench, chiseling and planing and sawing. Not one spoken word of his has been deemed worthy of record in the Scriptures, and yet which of the saints equals him in glory? St. Rita was but a servant maid. Bernadette Soubirous, a little peasant girl, was gathering sticks for firewood when Our Lady appeared to her in the grotto at Lourdes and spoke the memorable words, "I am the Immaculate Conception." St. Alphonsus Rodriguez, the Jesuit lay brother, worked out his sanctification mainly by saying his beads and answering the college doorbell. It is not the work we do or position we hold that makes us acceptable to God, but the spirit of fidelity we put into it. Men label occupations great or lowly, rating them by their scale of dignity. God has no such standard. He passes by the exterior nature of the work done, and views the interior disposition with which it is performed. Men are often not responsible for what tasks they are set to do. Some are placed as electric lights upon the mountains, others are but rushlights in the valley. Some are in command of armies, and others must serve in the trenches or take charge of the accoutrements. But one and all will be recompensed, not for what they did, so much as for the spirit of fidelity and zeal with which they served. The practice of charity and discharge of duty is the whole law and the prophets. Charity is the informing principle of all other virtues. Without it, no other virtue is meritorious of eternal reward, and with it all our actions may be minted into the golden coin of heaven. Charity, as has been intimated in the preceding chapters, will beget in us a lively faith, and make us realize the constant presence of God, purify our intentions, lead us to work for Him with zeal, fidelity, and industry, incite us to frequent and constant conversation with Him in prayer, and bring us to the altar in visits to the Blessed Sacrament and for its frequent reception. But when it has done all this, charity will still urge us onward. One of the saints said that work done for God is good, prayer is better, and suffering is best. And this brings us to the consideration of the mysterious property of charity, which prompts the Christian to desire to suffer for the beloved. No life is so unfortunate as to be without suffering of some kind. No day even is without some drops of this golden elixir. Christ Himself bade us take up our cross daily and follow Him, and thus sterling Christians, after the example of the apostles who went forth from stripes and chains rejoicing, have always thought it gain to suffer for Christ. The heart cry of St. Teresa was, to suffer or to die. St. John of the Cross, when asked by our Lord what reward he desired for his good deeds, replied, to suffer and be held in contempt for thy sake. St. Colette said the severest pain that could be sent her would be to pass a day without anything to suffer for God. And St. Ignatius, in his spiritual exercises, bids us pray for suffering. But whether we pray for it or not, suffering is bound to come in some shape or form. The saints particularly are destined to suffer. Misrepresentation, painful illness, and sometimes persecution unto death are their frequent lot. Their lives are not infrequently a long-drawn martyrdom. A curious instance regarding St. Lidwine of Schiedam has been preserved for us in a document drawn up and signed in the year 1421 by the civic officials of that town. They certify that she had been lying abed for 23 years, and within the preceding 7 had used no food or drink at all, and had slept all told scarcely the space of 2 nights. Her body could be moved only with the greatest care, and by wrapping cloths about it, lest it fall in pieces. After the writing of this document, the sufferer lived 12 years more, practically in the same condition, and though putrefaction in a repulsive form had set in, a sweet fragrance from her body filled the room. Many familiar instances of chronic and excruciating suffering are related in the history of the Church, and they are not unknown in our own time. Such pains, if endured patiently and cheerfully, will raise the sufferer to a high degree of sanctity. The desire of suffering has led some of the saints to torture their innocent bodies, to endure cruel fasts and keep lonely vigils. It led the anchorets to fill the deserts of old. It created the band of stylites who lived perpetually upon pillars, exposed without shelter to all the inclemency of the weather. It bred the race of recluses, men and women, who caused themselves to be perpetually immured in a solitary cell, with only an opening for the admission of food. These are the extreme examples of the saints, whom we are called to admire, but probably not to imitate. Their spirit, however, we can imbibe, at least so far as to undergo with resignation and cheerfulness the trials sent us by God. For He will surely send them, and when they come we must remember they are gifts from His hand, gifts of mercy and love. They are meant for our purification and sanctification. And what is the ordinary man or woman called to suffer? Sprinkled freely through our days will be rebuffs, humiliations, toil, unrewarded effort, unsuccessful labors, desires unfulfilled, and perhaps poverty and ill health. At one time the result of long untiring labor will be swept away. At another, our aims and ambitions will fall lamentably short of realization. Our work perhaps is unappreciated, unnoticed, and disregarded, while others are preferred before us. We lack talent that we desire or need for our work, or we have no proper field in which to use the abilities we possess. Or given talent and opportunity for its use, our efforts are thwarted by the ill will or indifference of those we would benefit. And with the most favorable of opportunities, how little can the ordinary man compass in a lifetime! Old age draws on apace and seizes us in its talons before perhaps we have fairly shaped our ideals. And death, the foe of all, is soon seen beckoning to us from over the river, and when it calls, its demands are peremptory. We cannot bribe or coax it to bide a while until we complete our unfinished tasks. Every Christian, in imitation of Christ, must mount to Calvary's height and lay down his life, the supreme act of each earthly existence. But love is strong as death, and it must endure to the end. The fear of death will not daunt the Christian soul. His faith teaches him it is but the entrance into life, and hence St. Paul desired to be dissolved and be with Christ. The Christian who has led a mortified life, who is crucified to the world, and to whom the world is crucified, will not regret to die. He will welcome death as a release from bondage, as a call from exile to his home in heaven. When he enters into the valley, and darkness begins to fall upon him, and the tawdry panorama of life is crumbling into pieces about him, he will hold fast by the hand faith and hope and charity, and sinking into a gentle sleep with their arms about him, he will wake in the blessed land to find that faith has given place to vision, hope to fruition, while charity remains to bind him to God forever. And love, that was the beginning and the middle, is now become the end. End of chapter 16. End of A Story of Love by Francis Cassilly.